welcome to Exotica. My name's Randy Moggins. I think for those of us who follow the phenomena of the paranormal, especially the UFO phenomena, we occasionally encounter these odd junctures with the world of UFOs and some of the other things that we've talked about on these shows. Certainly those of you who have followed my other show, The Threshing Floor, know that I have, for a number of years, been heavily investigating the infiltration of government by right-wing extremist groups, and I have a deep interest in the influence on religion and politics as well. And my guest tonight is going to bring us some very interesting information that actually covers a lot of the bases that I think I've kind of been tunneling through in my journeys down the rabbit trail over these years. My guest is Nick Redfern, and those of you who have followed ufology, certainly on the web, but are readers and listeners are going to recognize Nick's voice, and he's been out there for a long time doing really journeyman's work in the area of the paranormal, not just UFOs, but cryptozoology and many other subjects as well. The topic tonight is one that I think is important to really get some understanding about because it points to some dangers that I've long suspected exist in the realm of ufology as well. It's a field that's fraught with deceptions, and what we're trying to do on this show is find the truth wherever it goes and try to ferret out the deceptions so that we can discern what the truth is. And obviously ufology is riddled with all kinds of disinformation and false trails along the way. My guest tonight has some very interesting information that I brought out, and, let's give props where props are due. Thanks to Chris Knowles over at Secret Sun for his article that he posted on September 10th. The book is called Final Events, and it has to do with a conspiracy that I believe, as Nick will unfold to you tonight, has to do with some very deep secrets that have been kept from public knowledge. Nick, welcome to Exotica.
Well, thanks, Randy. Thanks for having me on the show.
And I guess to start off, you've been publishing for a long time. How many books have you written now? I think I lost count at 8.
I think about 18, something like that.
Oh, my. Busy.
Been a few of them.
And maybe you could just give us like a thumbnail sketch, your background, how you started, because I think you started writing and investigating in this field at a rather young age.
Yeah, well, what had basically happened, Randy, was that my interest, I guess, began with cryptozoology when I was about 6 or 7, something like that. Went on holiday with my mum and dad to Scotland, and we spent a day at Loch Ness, and my dad told me this story about the Loch Ness Monster. And of course, at that age, you're not sort of fully conversant or able to appreciate the sort of concepts, I suppose, and you sort of equate it with, when you're 5, 6, 7, with stories about, monsters under the bed or in the closet, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But, as I got older, sort of 11, 12, I began reading more and more books on things like Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, and then stuff like John Keel's books on Mothman. Mm-hmm. And then from there, delving into the whole UFO mystery and really sort of having an appreciation of all this various phenomena. Then, when I finished school, I began working on a music magazine back in England, a rock music magazine called Zero, and I did that for a couple of years, and then thought, well, why not try and combine the interest in paranormal stuff with the background that I'd developed in working in the field of journalism. And so that's sort of basically what I did. So I began sort of working in the writing field when I was about 17, something like that. And just sort of kind of took it from there, really. So. What
was your earliest interest in ufology?
Well, I think, although, I'd sort of delved into, like I said, a lot of early stuff when I was at a young age, like 11, 12, John Keel, Brad Steiger, Gray Barker, authors like that. I think the one area that sort of interested me more than any other was the whole issue of government involvement in the subject, because I figured that although, anybody conceivably could have the one UFO incident or encounter that solves the subject and the puzzle overnight, I figured that if anybody had more information than anybody else, it would probably be certain people in government. They're the people with access to aircraft and radar and files, etc. So I kind of focused more, even from the earlier stages of doing research, into trying to get information through the Freedom of Information Act, securing government documents and files, that sort of thing, and just trying to see what was known at an insider level, if you like.
Have you yourself ever directly encountered any type of craft or entity?
No, I haven't. It's one of these things where I think people get into the subjects for two reasons. One is that, you have a life-changing experience when you have a really profound UFO sighting or encounter, and that happens to a lot of people. I think that's what gets them involved in the subject. Or you're kind of like me, where you're a little bit detached from it, but you have a deep interest in it, but you're kind of outside, looking in rather than being someone who's had the experience looking out, so to speak.
Yeah, I actually find it useful that we have people in this field that are, I won't call them skeptics, but they have enough distance from the subject emotionally and experientially to be able to look at it from the standpoint of a journalist. Yeah,
don't get me wrong, I wouldn't call myself a skeptic. I mean, I do fully believe there's a genuine UFO phenomenon that has nothing to do with us. I do think some UFOs are military craft. I do believe that.
Yes.
But I think there is a genuine UFO phenomenon that has been with us for a very long time, and which is nothing to do with us. It is some sort of higher intelligence, advanced intelligence, whatever it may be. So, I'm not a skeptic. But I have an open mind as to what the origin of this phenomenon might be. A lot of people are certain it's extraterrestrial. I'm not. I look at things like the extraterrestrial angle, but also the idea of, multiple dimensions, maybe things, that could be explainable by quantum physics that allow for extra dimensions to exist. I think the more I've gone down the research path, if you like, the more I've become inclined to think that rather than dealing with literal extraterrestrials, we could be dealing with entities that kind of coexist with us.
Yes.
And that kind of flit in and out of our reality rather than literally traveling from point A to point B across some vast star system or whatever.
Yeah, I tend to share that view with you as well.
It doesn't rule out the idea. It doesn't rule out the idea that there are extraterrestrials. I just think that our visitors, whatever they might be, could be more closer to home, if you like. So.
Yeah, and I think you've even entertained the idea that they may actually be of a terrestrial origin in some of your writings.
Yeah, I mean, a number of people have looked at this, whether, particularly a friend of mine who died last year, Matt Tonis, the idea that an ancient terrestrial race that sort of lives alongside us in stealth. Or, as I said, perhaps something that can be explainable by other dimensions, extra dimensions, and that maybe that we can even access them, in sort of altered states of mind, open doorways that way.
Sure, yeah.
Rather than literally traveling from point A, as I said, to point B or whatever.
So maybe now we can move into the present subject, which is the book. And what I'd like to go into with you is this mysterious group called the Collins Elite, and how you were basically made wise of the existence of this group and what your sense is about the history of the group, and maybe just bring us through the timeline. Obviously, you were brought into knowledge of this by somebody that I think maybe some of the more experienced UFO people would know, and that's Ray Boueche.
Yeah, that's right. Basically what happened, Randy, was that, sometimes when in the UFO subject, witnesses or whoever will just call you up and say, are you interested in hearing this story? And then it kind of sends you off on like a really big trail in pursuit of a big story. That actually didn't happen in this case. Sometimes stories do drop in your lap, and other times, you come across them in different, very alternative ways, and that certainly applies here. What basically happened was that over the course of about the last 15 years, Ray Boueche, who is a former state director of the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON, he was a state director for Nebraska, and Ray currently still lives in Lincoln, Nebraska. But he's also an Anglican priest. And Ray had mentioned in a number of lectures, and his story had actually been told in literally like half a page in a couple of books, once in 1994 in one of Linda Howe's books, and which was about 2 pages of material, and then once about a page or so in one of Jenny Randall's books in the late 1990s. And it basically related this story that Ray had sort of, I guess, told to a fragmentary degree, about how in late 1991 he'd been approached by two members of a secret project within the Department of Defense that were looking at the whole UFO subject and actually trying to contact the entities that most people in ufology would call the Greys, these sort of little diminutive dwarf-like creatures with the big heads and the big black eyes. Mm-hmm. And the idea of this project was to try and liaise with these beings, if you like, and understand their mind powers and see if the military could harness or could learn the sort of same mind powers they possess and harness them as a weapon. In other words, try and teach spies, if you like, human spies, human beings, to use the mind as a weapon to induce like heart attacks and strokes at a distance. In other words, like psychic assassinations. Mm-hmm. And these two guys who approached Ray were very, very worried and concerned because they claimed, and bear in mind, it is a claim. Obviously, we don't know in this sort of hall of mirrors scenario where the truth really lies. But they claimed that the more they dug into this project, that these entities that they were in contact with, which they never described as aliens or the Greys, they called them NHEs, which stood for non-human entities. The story was that these two guys and other people on the project came to view these creatures or beings as sort of like deceptive entities, and they viewed them quite literally as demons. I mean, when I say literally, I do mean literally. Now, Ray had alluded, as I said, to this in a number of books, but the story had never been really told to its full extent. And so one of the days I just thought, when I was actually digging through one of these books for information on another project and stumbled across Ray's story again, I thought, well, I keep popping this story up every couple of years. Why don't I actually track Ray down, see if he's interested in being interviewed, and see if we can take the story any further? So that's what I did. I just literally tracked him down, called him up and said, hey, Ray, really interesting story. I've not really heard much about this angle before. Are you interested in me interviewing you and just seeing if we can take it further? And Ray was happy to do so, and he told me the whole story about how these guys had approached him. They told him all about the project they were working on and how things started to go like dark and all this negativity seemed to loom and hang over the project. And that, as I said, they felt they were dealing with something not extraterrestrial, but something that was masquerading as extraterrestrial, essentially to try and get its claws into the human race and, from the group's perspective, kind of pull us over to the dark side, if you like. And so what happened was that Ray related the story, but he also related a few things that he asked me not to publish, and which, when he told me why, I agreed not to, but it essentially related to the way in which he speculated as to how these people had found him and why they contacted him. And when he related this to me, although, as I said, I didn't publish these only small snippets of information and names, etc., it did give me enough leads and material to follow the story further and to contact colleagues, if you like, of some of the people that Ray's sources had been in touch with. And then it was a case of speaking to them, then putting me in touch with other people and really sort of developing the story from there, if you like, of, trying to understand the nature of this group, when it was formed, and how and why it came to these specific belief systems. So
maybe we could go back and examine when this group began to form and what their base of operation was. How did this group come to coalesce, and what was the time frame on the initial formation?
Well, actually, in some respects at least, the group seems to have been around since pretty much the early days of UFO research and UFO encounters in the so-called modern era, i.e. Kenneth Arnold's sighting in the summer of 1947. Now, for roughly the first 3 or 4 years, maybe a little bit longer, the group sort of didn't really exist as such. It was basically a case of a bunch of guys getting together after work who were all sort of working in the intelligence community, specifically in the LA region, Los Angeles. And essentially having an interest in UFOs, having an interest in the occult, and also being involved in an espionage operation, all of these guys, which was directed against a man named Jack Parsons.
Right.
Jack Parsons was an early, brilliant rocket scientist in the U.S., who was a devotee of Aleister Crowley, one of the most famous or infamous, players in the whole occult
the beast.
world, if you like. Exactly, the beast, the great beast. And Crowley had allegedly in 1918 conjured up or invoked this being that identified itself as Lamb, while Crowley was undertaking this extensive ritual called the Amalantra working, which essentially involved him ingesting mescaline and hashish to enter an altered state, and then reportedly, I guess channeled might be the best way to describe it, or invoke this being, which, if you see the pictures of it, or him, or whatever it is, Lamb looks very much like sort of a proto-alien grey, like a large head, sort of diminutive shoulders, and these piercing eyes. And it's not too different from what we see in abduction stories today. Well, Parsons, became a big follower of Crowley, and actually ran one of his outfits in California. But as I said, he was also a brilliant rocket scientist, and because he was working with the Army, Navy, and Air Force in the sort of early burgeoning period of rocket research, he was actually given a top-secret clearance with the military, which sort of afforded him glimpses into all sort of secret projects. Well, what happened was that Parsons, when the State of Israel was set up, he heard that the Israelis were looking to set up their own rocket program, and because he'd got his own company, Aerojet, which even to this day makes the solid rocket boosters for NASA's space shuttle program, he said, well, or thought to himself, wouldn't it be a great idea if I was able to get a job working with the Israelis as well? So he did something very stupid. He stole or borrowed, however you want to term it, a bunch of documents from his workplace, which at the time was the Hughes Aircraft Company, with the view to showing them to the Israelis, saying, look, this is the sort of stuff I'm working on. And of course, when the military inevitably found out, their first worry was that, is he actually working as a spy for the Israelis? But when an extensive investigation was undertaken, but it proved that he wasn't really working or spying for the Israelis. He was just being very reckless and was trying to find an alternative way to get employment with them by taking documents from work and saying, look, aren't I clever? And so what happened was that many of the people who were the original incarnation of this group, the Collins elite, were the guys who were involved in this espionage investigation of Parsons, and they said that the more they dug into his private life, the more fascinated they got by this so-called other world he inhabited in other words, the occult world. And they began to put pieces together and found that he'd actually met Kenneth Arnold, the man who coined, the term flying saucer.
Yes.
He was also acquainted with Robert Goddard, who was a rocket scientist who moved his base of operations to, of all places, Roswell, New Mexico. And Parsons was deeply interested in UFOs as well. So in other words, these people were sort of having off-the-record meetings after work saying, hey, this guy's really interested and he seems to be involved in a lot of areas that now the military's involved in terms of the early UFO investigations. And so they began to look into him more and more. And the story that I got was that by the early 50s, when groups like Project Blue Book and Project Grudge weren't having that much success in the Air Force determining exactly what was going on, somebody said, well, why don't we fund these other guys and, set them up in like a think tank scenario, take them out of their normal everyday intelligence positions and hire them, for a couple of years to see if they can come up with any conclusions that might help answer the UFO subject, even if they're delving into alternative areas like occultism, Crowley and Parsons. And it seems to be the case that that's literally how it began. It was like a think tank group, very sort of fluid and almost like semi-official or quasi-official to begin with, where, it literally was a case of, well, here's some money, see what you can find out, and if nothing happens after a couple of years, well, you tried, but we'll go back to things like Blue Book and checking radar reports and pilot encounters. So in other words, it was a case of somebody funding the group to look at things from more of like an archaic, ritualistic, demonic angle, if you like, based on the theorizing that Crowley might have and Parsons may have sort of opened gateways to let some sort of interdimensional entities through that these guys eventually came to view as demonic rather than just interdimensional.
Do we have a sense of where the name Collins got appended to this at all?
Yeah, that's actually a very weird and strange story.
Yes.
It's actually nothing to do with a person's name or anything like that at all. What happened was that when the group first started, they began consulting with various people, like, for example, demonologists, people in the religious community who'd studied ancient texts, on everything like demonology and the mythology of, for example, ancient Babylonia and things like that, to try and get a handle on whether any of these entities that were being reported today had parallels, with ancient stories. And, if there was something that sort of suggested it was actually these things are the same thing that were being seen 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, were still being seen now. And one of the people they supposedly consulted was actually a Quaker who was from a little tiny town in New York called Collins. And Collins was an extremely small town that was actually founded by Quakers a couple of centuries ago. And at one point, the town boasted, if that's the right word, of actually having no less than 8 cheese factories. And pretty much everybody in town was employed in the cheese-making industry. But this one guy, this Quaker, who was like a consultant to the Collins elite, because he had a deep interest in the whole issue of demonology and had developed an extensive library on it and was kind of off the records consulted. The group members, or the people at the time, kind of joked that he was the only person in Collins who wasn't employed in the cheese industry because he was working for them, and so they called him the elite of Collins. And then they just decided, like as an in-joke, to call the group the Collins elite, and it sort of grew from there. But it may be the case that although that was an off-the-record name, I don't discount the possibility that it could have today an official name. But if it does, that was never revealed to me. I was only sort of given the off-the-record original nickname that somebody came up with. But I do think it is possible that, I was deliberately not told of what its present-day name might be.
Do you have the sense in your research that this particular group held to a certain theological mode, that they were predisposed towards, I guess, what we would call fundamental Christianity?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I think, to begin with, I think the original members certainly were quite open-minded and came to the conclusion that they were dealing with something like supernatural, paranormal, and that had negative overtones. But as time went on and they began to develop more and more theories and put the strands together, they came to view it as sort of more of a black and white Christian angle of God versus devil, angels versus fallen angels, and then looking at whole things like biblical prophecies and Armageddon. And then further down the line, those people who viewed it from a biblical perspective were kind of elbowed out by people who had a really radical fundamentalist approach. So, in other words, it seems to have been in 3 strands. There were the people who thought Crowley and Parsons were opening doorways to negative paranormal realms. That there was then sort of mutated into like a Christian interpretation of you might get taught in schools even or whatever. But from there, it sort of developed into more ominous areas of a radical fundamentalist approach that, no, this is what's going on, we're right, and we need to try and indoctrinate the population as to why we're right and find a way to basically save the population from the clutches of these demonic entities. And if that means sort of invoking martial law and state surveillance, then so be it.
Yeah, and I want to get to that. I noticed in the book that you referenced some of their base texts, and one of them was interesting to me because it was Edward Langton's 1949 Essentials of Demonology, which is a book that I don't think many people know about, but I've studied these subjects for years in the area, especially in the area of what's called deliverance in Christianity. And I found it interesting that they referenced Langton's work because Langton's work points to the demonic. It's actually a work that's been used by missionaries in the foreign fields where they're dealing with, obviously, your most extreme versions of that would be the dervishes and the tribal medicine men in different regions. And I found it interesting that they were using that as kind of an anchor because it sort of now roots the UFO ET phenomena to something that would be a little more palpable spiritually to a fundamentalist Christian.
Yeah, I think this points to several issues. One, they recognized that, I'll be the first to admit, I don't personally agree with, all the theories or hardly any of the theories they came to personally. This isn't my story.
Right, exactly, yeah.
I'm relating this, or what I do find interesting, I should say, and that I do agree with them, is that the UFO phenomenon didn't kick off in 47. I think it's a very old phenomenon that's been with us for a very long time, and maybe it even changes its motif an appearance to sort of suit the people of the times for whatever reason. And I think they recognized this also, which is why they did specifically begin looking at ancient texts and books like Langdon's, because they realized that there were parallels. You can go back into some of the early years of demonology from like ancient Babylonia and find stories where, these demonic entities would supposedly invade people's bedrooms in the middle of the night. Mm-hmm. There'd be like sexual assaults, or they would have like this obsessive interest in babies and reproduction. Yeah. And, it's kind of similar to what we get today in abduction stories. The whole genetic angle of hybrid children and DNA splicing and extraction of sperm and eggs and things like that. In fact, the only thing that's changed is the belief as to where these entities come from and what they are. Back then it was demons. Today it's extraterrestrials whose race is on a genetic decline, if you like.
We're going to take a break here, and when we come back, we're going to dig into this a little bit more and try and understand what is going on inside our government and why this could potentially lead to a future martial law situation. We'll be right back after these messages on Exotica.
Please stay tuned. Exotica will be right back.
My guest today, Nick Redfern, and we're talking about the Collins elite and the information that Nick has brought out in his latest book. And Nick, before we go any further, it'd probably be a good idea for you to give the listeners some contact information where they can find you, where they can find your books as well.
Yeah, people can contact me at my website, which is nickredfern.com. It's an easy one. And I have a lot of blogs that I link at, my own blogs I link at the websites, where I update on various research and things I'm doing into the field of UFOs and cryptozoology and conspiracies, and people can find all the sort of latest news on these relevant topics at the blogs, but they can contact me and learn more about the books at the website.
And the book we're talking about tonight is your most recent, I believe, Final Events?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just published about a month ago.
So when we broke off for the break at the half hour, we had sort of thumbnailed through this, but not in a lot of detail. To get back to this juncture in 1946, 1947, and now we have the formation of this Collins group, which is, what would you term this, a working group within the intelligence military community, Nick?
Yeah, that's probably the best way to describe it. It wasn't like an agency like the CIA, where there's thousands of employees in one set building. It seems to be more along the lines of a kind of a fluid organization where people would get together but would have funding to investigate things, and they would have regular jobs, but they seem to have been, in the early years at least, they were taken away or offered a position away from their regular jobs. Over time it seemed to become more of a stable official project, although a very deeply buried project, possibly even funded with black funding, if you like, to where, the more that time went on and the more that they began to develop interest at an official level, I think to start with, they were kind of seen as that bunch of weirdos, in office number 4, 5, 6, 7 or whatever, looking into demons and UFOs, and people kind of gave them the wide berth. But then over time, they began to develop more of an interest and a following in government, and actually quite a few influential people, I think, to where they began getting more money, a wider scope, and an ability to do more investigations. And then it sort of developed from there into pretty much like a project, an official project, albeit a very deeply buried one.
At what juncture, the best your research can show you, did this group begin to move into what I guess we would call almost this eschatological trajectory? Because it's very clear that they have a fundamentalist view, certainly a view in terms of what we would call fundamentalist end times prophecy, meaning they are not preterists, they're futurists. They therefore believe in a literal fulfillment of the events outlined in the book of Revelation, and they begin to tie all of this in as well.
Yeah, I think if you look at the story that was given to me, at least, it seems to be the case that until probably the latter part of the 1960s, they were looking at it all from the perspective that there was nothing positive about the UFO subject they came to view, but they kind of viewed it as like a paranormal, supernatural thing with these entities were clearly from somewhere else. They didn't believe they were extraterrestrial, and they believed they were hostile to us. But they also kind of concluded that these beings seemed to have the ability to utilize advanced technology, but equally they were comfortable sort of in the realm of ancient rite and ritual. However, by the latter 60s, early 70s, they began to dig further into stories suggesting that these entities were deeply interested in or obsessed with the human soul. They actually uncovered a number of stories where people claimed to have had near-death experiences, and during these near-death experiences had claimed to have seen in some sort of other dimensional realm or heaven or hell, however you want to term it, kind of like strange, fast-moving flying saucer type craft that at least one of the people described as almost like mechanical worker bees that he believed were extracting souls from the recently departed. And it was kind of likened, as one of them said, to like vast, never-ending soul factories where we were being literally farmed and harvested of our souls. And that's kind of when it went from being something that was looking at the teachings of Parsons and Crowley to, well, we've just uncovered the truth. These are actually, deceptive demons of Satan, and the earth is a farm, and our whole purpose here is to be farmed and reaped of our souls for some sort of poorly defined soul energy that these entities literally feed upon. Kind of like you've seen the Matrix film when Keanu Reeves suddenly wakes up and finds himself in this one of millions and millions of never-ending rows of pods where we're all being, farmed of our life force to feed the machines, kind of like that. Certainly through the 70s, that was an agenda and a belief system. And then definitely through the Reagan administration in the early 80s is when they got a huge amount of additional funding. And because Reagan, was sort of deeply interested in a lot of these areas, the end times philosophies and things like that. It seems to be that then is when it sort of really went from kind of like a horizontal line, of following this to a vertical line of following that. Of course, as time has progressed, we've seen now, you can leave the Collins Elite out the story, but there's no doubt that the more, we sort of look into the way trends are changing today, you see like the military being almost like indoctrinated with, the idea that they're religious warriors, fighting in the Middle East for the battle between good and evil instead of just being soldiers fighting war. So we are seeing some of the things that the Collins Elite wanted to put into place. In other words, the notion of channeling religion further into governments and the military and having a deeper end times fundamentalist scenario, if you like.
In the research that you did, was it possible for you to ascertain that they had ever formally or informally posted what I guess you would call their doctrines, their findings, their understandings about this? And the reason I'm asking you this is because there exists now within the subculture of the UFO realm an entire group of, I will call them so-called Christians, who are operating in the UFO milieu, claiming these exact doctrines, that these are demons, that this is like an exorcism. Some of them are trotting out the idea of stopping alien abduction with the name of Jesus. There's a lot of doctrines out there that are being shopped out to the general UFO public now under the banner of what I see as being the doctrines that look to me like they were probably promulgated by the Collins Elite.
Well, that's actually a very good question. I mean, on the one hand, we have the story of Ray Boueche, who was approached by these guys in 1991, which is pretty much 20 years ago now. On the one hand, the story on the surface appears to be that these guys were worried and wanted to get the story out. On the other hand, it could be a subtle way of promoting the story so that people come around to accepting it. You kind of approach people under the guise of being concerned about what's going on, but equally it almost sort of spreads it like a meme, if you like, throughout the peripheral edges of the UFO field, and then maybe it spreads further. I know they also contacted Linda Howe, although not in person, but by letter. And, there have been a few other people who, for example, have spoken about how there are supposedly people in the intelligence community who are concerned about some sort of eschatological event coming along in the future that's connected with UFO subjects. So I think what's happened is that there have been subtle attempts to sort of, not necessarily, as you said, publish this story, but to sort of spread it, to almost sort of brilliantly indoctrinate or have people come around to the notion that this is feasible. And I guess the more they view it as being feasible, eventually a lot of people are actually going to come to fully believe it. And of course, when that happens, then, these people have a lot more, I guess, people on their side, and, the whole idea of control factors come into play, and how can we exploit this to change society in many respects.
Well, I think my studies indicate that there's a claimed number of 50 million so-called born-again Christians in the United States, and I'm not trying to offend anyone. I'm basically stating that way because the numbers themselves are pretty high. But we see a seeding into the Christian community of this very notion, and this is actually a movement that I've been following for a number of years, and I find it interesting that the time frame when this began to emerge was actually somewhere around the late 1980s, early 1990s, when you began to see deliverance ministries in the Christian side of things start to pop up and transition into alien abduction and UFO type scenarios.
Yeah, I think, although I'll be the first bit, I don't have evidence, it wouldn't surprise me if the more, we dig into this story, we do find that there may have been sort of subtle approaches between some of these people and people in, various religious communities and people in the UFO community. Mm-hmm. One of the things I do know, that a lot of people in the UFO community are interested in this aspect of the subject, but they're fearful about talking about it because they worry they're going to get kicked off the lecture circuit, etc. It's kind of a sort of a wimpy way out, you know what I mean?
Well, I think you and I both know that the UFO community's rather divided, because on the one hand of it, you have extreme, and I don't like the term, I don't have anything better to describe it than being either a cultic or what we would loosely call New Age, but that's a term as slippery as we would say fundamentalist Christians. Yeah. There seems to be a theological thread on both sides of it, but they seem highly divided, and then we come down to the division that comes with, are these beings, these entities, as I like to call them, are they benevolent or are they malevolent? And again, you find a very strict division among many of the UFO investigators out there.
Yeah, you're right. And I think what this demonstrates more than anything else is that we know something's going on, but we don't have a lot of the answers. So what happens is we develop a lot of hypotheses and belief systems instead. Now, my view is that there's nothing wrong with having a belief system about UFOs if you earnestly and honestly come to a particular conclusion. Where I sort of draw the line is then when people use these belief systems and try and manipulate them as a means of control. That's the problem. I don't care if somebody who's 40 years old believes in Santa Claus. If they're not doing anybody any harm, well, it's a strange belief system, but so what?
Exactly.
But it's like with this phenomenon, if there are people in government who believe that aliens, UFOs have demonic origins, well, that's an unusual thing, but on the other hand, governments, agencies often fund unusual projects. That's a fact. They do funnel money into alternative ideas and theories. Where I think you're crossing the line is if a group concludes that, yes, aliens are demons, but then says, well, hang on a minute, we believe this, we know, we're arrogant enough to say we're right, and so what we're going to do is, come hell or high water, we're going to convince everybody we're right, and they're going to come round to our way of thinking, and we're going to reconstruct things according to the way it should be. In other words, according to the way they want things, and their belief system becomes like a totalitarian dictatorship almost, where you will live according to these rules because it's in your best interest, because it'll keep the demons at bay, if you like.
And that brings us to the scenario that I believe you outlined in the book, and I believe it's what Chris Knowles was basically going directly to the throat for in his interview with you. This idea that this group, which has now completely, I guess, taken over what we would call the Collins elite, the working group, adopting an Old Testament theological system and shutting down the country under martial law to protect the citizenry of the United States with a surveillance network as well in order to prevent soul snatching. So we have an enforcement Force theocracy, Orwellian-type culture that's being advocated by this group.
Yeah, that's exactly what we have. I couldn't have put it better. It is basically a situation where they feel that because they conclude that these entities are literally sort of harvesting the human soul, one of the conclusions they reached, and I truthfully don't know how they reached this, that was never made clear to me, was that these entities, according to the Collins elite, can actually be kept at bay by denial in their existence or denial that they can affect us. So in other words, if you put up a mental barrier, they're unable to break through it. It's kind of like the vampire in ancient legends can only be allowed in the house if you invite him in. It's sort of like that. And so they concluded in sort of a skewed, roundabout fashion that if they can quite literally, I don't mean this in ironic terms, but quite literally put the fear of God into people, then it will keep these entities at bay. And they conclude that the only way to really have a population that is living in fear of these entities and has a deep belief system, that's the wrath of God, etc., is to indoctrinate them in the sort of Old Testament blood and thunder, wrath of God type scenarios, and rework the mindset of the population. And the only way they felt they could do that was, you can't just ask people to go to church on a Sunday and start preaching them radical belief systems. So they concluded that if something like an event occurred in the US, like a terror event or something like that, whether provoked or allowed to happen, that they could then invoke sort of the worst parts of the Patriot Act, put the country under surveillance, lock down from the outside world, control the TV and the media, etc., which the Patriot Act allows for all of this, shut down the internet, and essentially over 5, 10, 15 years started working on younger generations until, 15 years down the line, the country is like a martial law state run by a group along the... I don't think for 1 minute it would have been run by the Collins elite, but it would have been run by people within governments and influential positions who adhere to these particular ideas and belief systems.
Well, very clearly what you had in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan, numerous allusions, both extraterrestrials and to his belief in the fulfillment of a literal Book of Revelations end times prophecy scenario. Very interesting combination of things. He never articulated it greatly, but, 3 times in record, Reagan referenced the fact that it'd be very unifying for us if we were faced with an outside alien attack. Yeah. In other words, hostile.
Right. The other interesting thing about Reagan is that when he left office, people used the Freedom of Information Act to actually find out what books, he had on his bookshelves in the White House library. You can do that, when obviously before someone's president, they have their own house in whichever city, and then when they move, they don't obviously take all their furniture because White House furniture, but their possessions, that is obviously they take. And, for example, some of the books that Reagan had on his shelves, the Freedom of Information Act has shown, one of them was the Schofield Reference Bible, which basically, one of the central themes, predicted the end of the world from beginning in Beirut, Lebanon. And another one was Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth, which also predicted Armageddon breaking out for a military confrontation in Lebanon. So in other words, you have Reagan having books all like this all strewn across his library and spouting stuff about UFOs, and it does make me think or strongly believe that he had some knowledge of the group and their belief systems and what they were talking about, and actually came to accept them. And I think within these, it's a bit of a grey area, but it's in this particular era and period, I think, that things sort of really started to go the wrong way, if you like.
Obviously, it's going to take some type of scenario that would cause this type of extreme lockdown of the country. I mean, we're not talking even... 9/11 did a pretty good job hosing down a lot of the constitutional rights and taking away freedoms that Americans had long taken for granted. We're talking about something now on a scale that I think would have to be an event of real close to what... And the buzzword's disclosure. Or maybe the better term would be exposure of an ET presence or the perception of an ET presence. The military is in possession of exotic technology that we believe has been developed in the Cold War period, and where that technology came from is also, a great deal of speculation. but it is completely within their domain to be able to stage an event very similar to a holographic projection or even a full-scale invasion staged onto city skylines around the world using something like Project Bluebeam, for instance. What is your sense it would take in order to do this, barring the fact that there would actually be a genuine disclosure of ET presence?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. One of the things that I found was that when Ray Boueche was approached way back in 91 by these two DOD guys, one of the things they told him was that the military was working on this highly advanced project to create a hologram-type technology, but it went a stage further. It was almost like the hologram technology could tap into the mindset of the people, and it would actually, its perception, if you like, would change based on the cultural beliefs of the people. That, in other words, it was like almost like an intelligent hologram that could actually, be at almost like a subatomic level. It could interact with the environment and with the minds of the population. Now, that sounds bizarre, but that's what Ray was told was going on. Now, of course, that sounds very similar to things like, these rumors about things like Project Bluebeam, the idea of creating fantastic holograms in the sky that seem far more than just like a mirage, broadcast onto a cloud, reflected off a cloud or whatever. And one of the people I interviewed from the Collins elite who left the group, as he worded it, in disgust, was because he was one of the earlier members who thought, yeah, this seems paranormal, but, didn't want to go down this more extreme path. And he said that although he saw no evidence that this sort of project was put into place, he said there was definitely in the post-9/11 era, like a round table meeting where a discussion was made, could we pull off a staged event? He said it was like a PowerPoint presentation. Could we pull off like a staged event to alter the mindset of the population? And, my view is that, when people are driven by fear, it's very easy to do any kind of like in the US today. So the whole 9/11 thing, everybody, you go to the airport, nobody thinks twice about taking the shoes off. Everybody does it like robots because you've been conditioned. That's what you now have to do. And the important thing is, I said, you don't have to be told to do it anymore. People just do it. So I think one of these situations where, a really bad event that was sort of far worse than 9/11 would, in many respects, allow for even further massive, alterations to society to occur pretty much overnight. And I think that people say, well, there's no way it could happen. But people today take it for granted that there's widespread surveillance of email and phone calls and et cetera, and that agencies watch us to a greater degree. And, you have this old thing, which I think is one of the most appalling things anyone could ever say. It's like, well, if I'm not doing anything wrong, what does it matter if the government watches me? Well, of course it matters. They shouldn't be watching if you're not doing anything wrong. But I think sometimes when there's a really cataclysmic event, people hunker down, they get panicked, and they just say, okay, I'll let the government deal with it. And that's the dangerous point. It's like in the film V for Vendetta, where they said, people shouldn't be afraid of their governments should be afraid of their people.
Exactly.
And that's true.
Yeah.
That we elect them, allegedly, so they're working for us, not the other way around.
I can't help but feel that the information you brought out this year was beyond fortuitous and timely, because we're seeing more and more. You talk about memes. I think the biggest meme in this realm right now is the meme of disclosure, which everybody's talking about and which everybody is just endlessly frustrated about, because even though some of the governments, especially in Europe, have opened up some of their files, certainly here in the United States, it appears that the government has been very cagey about this. They have not disclosed a whole lot of information one way or another, and you know as well as I do that even the flow of FOIAs anymore is begrudging, and that they're largely larded with black ink where they've taken out critical information as well. I guess where I'm looking at this is I see some very interesting things on the horizon, certainly pointing towards 2012, and whatever your perception of that may be, there just seems to be this buzz that 2012 has the promise of a disclosure, either real or contrived. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I actually do. Personally, as someone who's studied a lot of prophecies and things like this, I think they're very, very interesting, but, history shows that they very rarely come true. Now, that doesn't mean that the Mayans weren't very clever people who had some fantastic technologies and powers, and, who knows what they knew. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the prophecies as they predicted will come true in 2012.
Sure.
What I do wonder if there are people in government who are going to exploit the 2012 prophecies and, actually make them come true. Not because they're actually fulfilling the prophecies or the prophecies are coming true, but if people think this is going to happen, let's kind of make it happen, and we can kind of exploit these ancient prophecies and kind of invoke or bring to the fore staged events that will allow for this sort of totalitarian state to be put into place. Now, it could go two ways. It could absolutely work and people will fall for it and they'll be fearful and give up their rights and the world will be changed overnight. Or people will rise up and it'll crumble if people see it as a ruse. Now, I think that's dependent upon how people react. For example, if you look back 30, 40 years when the whole flower power era, when there was a lot of protests and people were standing up and saying, this is wrong, this shouldn't be going on. Today, there's been almost like this brilliant indoctrination program where if you stand up and criticize the government, you're termed unpatriotic.
Yes.
And you're not. If you have a deep love and honour of your country and you see it going down the pan, there's nothing wrong with standing up and shouting and being proactive. But there is this view now that if you stand up and say something and complain about this, you're sinister. There's something unsettling about you. You're not a patriot. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
some people actually come to believe that. It's actually been, even I have to admit, it's been brilliantly executed.
And I guess that's the way I view the book. And again, for the listener, the book is Final Events and the Secret Government Group on Demonic UFOs and the Afterlife. And believe me, we've not even scratched the surface of this book. But I viewed the book, and I view, props to Chris Knowles because his interview was excellent. I view this as a warning, and I think whatever your position is on UFOs or ETs or whatever you believe about this, that there's a warning in this that extremism, especially when it's fashioned into a government martial law lockdown with a pretext such as what this book portrays, is extremely dangerous, and that we all have to become more discerning about the information that we process.
Yeah, I think more than anything else, what this demonstrates is the sinister power that belief systems can have when a few people who have the power, who hold the power and the influence, arrogantly believe that they're right and everybody else better listen to them or else. I think that's the dangerous point. And also, I think the biggest mistake this group made is in arrogantly believing that they were absolutely right in their beliefs. We always need to remember that when it comes to UFOs, the U still stands for unidentified. My view is that the best we can say is that there's an intelligence that interacts with us that comes from somewhere else. And maybe it doesn't always have our best interests at heart, but that doesn't mean the country has to go into lockdown and to fulfill ancient prophecies or, the ultimate battle between good or evil. It just means we're dealing with a phenomenon that we need to try and understand further and not get into that trap of thinking it's this or that.
And with that, I guess we'll close this interview out. Like I said, Nick, thank you so much for coming on and for bringing this forward. And to you, the listener, I think pick up the book. There's a warning inside of this and a lot of good information. And besides that, it's just a really interesting read. We'll pick this topic up again, I'm sure, and hopefully, Nick, you'll come back and talk to us some more in the near future.
Yeah, I'll be happy to.
Great. This has been Exotica. I'm Randy Moggins. The truth is out there. It's inside you. Keep looking for it.
This has been Exotica, an examination of the unusual, the paranormal, and the supernatural.